with a reluctant signature on the inheritance papers, and the promise to clear out his estranged grandfather's junkyard by the end of the month. Jack Miller unknowingly stepped into a Depression-era mystery that would transform his struggling farm and reveal a family legacy he never knew existed. For beneath the rusted hulks of abandoned vehicles and weather-worn scrap metal lay a concrete anomaly that powerful interests had spent decades trying to keep buried. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The early morning fog clung to the fields as Jack Miller guided his weathered pickup truck along the rutted dirt road leading to Copper Hill Salvage Yard. Tall weeds pushed through cracks in the concrete pad that had once served as the yard's foundation, and the chain-link fence that surrounded the property leaned at precarious angles, surrendering to years of neglect. This forgotten corner of Millfield County hadn't seen proper maintenance in almost 15 years. Jack hadn't planned on inheriting a junkyard. His life was carefully constructed around his small family farm, 40 acres of land that had once belonged to his parents, now struggling under the weight of 3 consecutive drought seasons and rising operational costs. At 34, with calloused hands and deepening worry lines across his forehead, Jack was barely keeping the farm afloat. The call from the attorney 2 days ago had been unexpected. "Your grandfather, Harold Miller, has passed away," the lawyer had explained. "Despite your family's estrangement, he's left you the Copper Hill Salvage Yard and all its contents." The estrangement was lawyer speak for a bitter 20-year family division. Jack's father had cut ties with his own father when Jack was just 14, taking his family away from Millfield and the salvage business that had been part of their lives. The reasons had never been fully explained, just vague references to business disagreements and his father's tight-lipped warning, "Some people will do anything for money." Jack, now 2 decades later, he was expected to deal with the abandoned property, clear it out, and prepare it for sale. According to the attorney, a month-long task that would close the final chapter on a family history he barely understood. The junkyard appeared through the thinning fog as Jack rounded the final bend. A sprawling 5-acre lot, filled with the skeletal remains of vehicles from every era, rusted-out sedans from the 70s, the hulking frames of farm equipment, stacks of flattened metal reaching toward the sky like industrial monuments. At the far edge stood a small office building with peeling paint and a sagging roof, the only proper structure on the property. Jack parked his truck beside the padlocked gate and fumbled with the set of keys the attorney had provided. The lock surrendered with a reluctant click, and the gate swung open with a haunting metallic groan. The scent of rust, old oil, and something else he couldn't quite place greeted him as he stepped onto the property that was now, inexplicably, his. The interior of the small office building was like stepping into a time capsule. A heavy metal desk covered with papers occupied one corner. Filing cabinets lined the walls, their surfaces layered with dust. A calendar from 2008 still hung on the wall, marking the month when his grandfather had apparently walked out and never returned to regular operations. "1 month isn't going to cut it," Jack muttered, running a finger along the dusty desk. The rational choice would be to call the attorney immediately, explain this was far more than he'd agreed to handle, sell the whole place to a scrap dealer for whatever he could get, and never look back. Yet something held him there. Perhaps curiosity about the grandfather he barely remembered, or the nagging questions about why his family had severed ties so completely. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As the morning light strengthened, Jack began a cursory inventory of the property. The junkyard was more organized than it had initially appeared. Vehicles were arranged in rough rows with paths between them. Scrap metal was sorted by type and stacked in designated areas. Whatever else his grandfather had been, he'd run an orderly operation. In the office, Jack found ledgers detailing purchases and sales going back decades. Harold Miller had kept meticulous records of every transaction, every vehicle acquired, every ton of metal sold. The most recent entries were from 2008, confirming Jack's suspicion about when operations had ceased. Flipping through the ledgers, Jack noticed a pattern. In the years leading up to 2008, his grandfather had been systematically purchasing certain types of scrap, particular models of farm equipment, specific makes of trucks. There seemed to be no logical business reason for these focused acquisitions. Many of the items were noted as non-resale in the margins. "What were you collecting, Grandpa?" Jack murmured, tracing his finger along a column of entries. As afternoon approached, Jack decided to get a better overview of what he was dealing with. The property had a slight elevation at its western edge, offering a vantage point over the entire yard. As he picked his way through the maze of metal, he was struck by the sheer volume of material. At current scrap prices, there might be enough here to save his struggling farm, provided he could find a buyer willing to clear it all. From the elevated position, Jack noticed something odd. The arrangement of larger pieces, buses, tractors, combines formed a rough circle in the center of the yard. Inside that circle, smaller vehicles and scrap piles created a densely packed area that was nearly inaccessible. It seemed deliberate, as if his grandfather had been protecting something at the center of his junkyard. Curiosity piqued, Jack began working his way toward this central point, climbing over fenders and squeezing between rusted chassis. The deeper he went into the metal labyrinth, the more convinced he became that this arrangement was intentional. At the heart of the circle, Jack found a small clearing no more than 15 feet across. The ground here was different, not the packed dirt and gravel of the rest of the yard, but what appeared to be a concrete pad. Most of it was covered by a large sheet of corrugated metal, held down by engine blocks at each corner. With considerable effort, Jack dragged one of the engine blocks aside and lifted the edge of the metal sheet. Beneath it, set into the concrete, was what appeared to be a door, a heavy steel hatch with an elaborate lock mechanism. The hatch was circular, reminiscent of a bank vault, with a wheel handle and a complex locking system that looked decades old. "What the hell?" Jack breathed, kneeling to examine the find. The hatch was securely locked, the mechanism showing signs of regular maintenance despite the abandoned state of the rest of the yard. Around its circumference were stamped numbers and what looked like a manufacturer's mark, Diebold -1937. Jack sat back on his heels, mind racing. A vault door, deliberately hidden at the center of his grandfather's junkyard, carefully protected by strategic placement of scrap. This wasn't random, this was calculated concealment. The sound of tires on gravel interrupted his thoughts. Someone had pulled up outside the gate. Jack made his way back through the maze of metal, emerging just as a sleek black SUV stopped beside his truck. A man in an expensive suit stepped out, scanning the junkyard with an air of distaste. "Mr. Miller?" the man called, spotting Jack. "Jack Miller?" "That's me," Jack replied cautiously, approaching the gate. "Yard's closed for business. Family matter." The man smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. "Richard Blackwood, Millfield Development Corporation. I understand you've recently inherited this property from Harold Miller." Jack nodded, immediately suspicious. "News travels fast." "Small county," Blackwood replied smoothly. "Our company has had an interest in this parcel for some time. We've been trying to acquire it for years, but your grandfather was unreceptive to our offers. Is that right?" Jack said, crossing his arms. "We're prepared to make you a very generous offer," Blackwood continued. $300,000, cash transaction, immediate closing. You wouldn't even need to clear the property, we'd handle all of that. The sum was substantial enough to save Jack's farm and provide a cushion for several years. Under normal circumstances, he would have jumped at such an offer for 5 acres of what was essentially a metal graveyard. But the hidden vault changed everything. Why would a development company offer so much for a junkyard? And why had his grandfather refused to sell, even as he apparently abandoned active operations? "I'm not looking to sell just yet," Jack said carefully. "Still figuring out what I've got here." Blackwood's pleasant demeanor cooled slightly. "I should mention that the zoning board is considering new regulations about industrial waste sites. This property could be subject to significant environmental remediation requirements in the near future. Very costly." The threat was thinly veiled, but Jack recognized it for what it was. "I'll keep that in mind. If you'll excuse me, I've got work to do." "Of course," Blackwood handed him a business card. "When you're ready to discuss terms, call me directly. Our offer won't stay open indefinitely." As the black SUV pulled away, Jack turned the card over in his hands. Something wasn't right. The development company's sudden appearance, the unexpectedly high offer, the subtle threat, all of it connected to the mysterious vault hidden at the center of the junkyard. Jack returned to his truck and called the only person he thought might have answers. His father had passed 3 years ago, but his mother was still alive, living in a small retirement community 2 hours away. "Mom," he said when she answered, "I need to ask you about Grandpa Harold's salvage yard." A long silence followed. "Why are you asking about that place, Jack?" "Because I've inherited it," he replied. "And I just found something strange there. A vault door, hidden under scrap metal. Do you know anything about it?" His mother's voice became strained. "Your father warned Harold that his obsession would cause trouble. I'm not surprised it finally has." "What obsession? What are you talking about?" "The Depression," she said cryptically. "Your grandfather believed the government wasn't telling the whole truth about it. Believed there was evidence right there in Millfield County. Started collecting things, hiding things. Your father thought he was becoming paranoid, especially after the threats started." "Threats? From who?" "Powerful people in the county. The same families that have controlled everything there since before the Depression. When your grandfather started talking about proof of what they'd done, things got dangerous. That's why your father moved us away." Jack's mind raced, connecting the pieces. "And now a development company is offering me a small fortune for the property." "Be careful, Jack," his mother warned. "Whatever is in that vault, people have been trying to get to it for decades. Your grandfather protected it his whole life. That's not something to take lightly." After ending the call, Jack sat in his truck, contemplating his next move. Night was falling, and he wasn't equipped to investigate the vault further without tools. He decided to return to his farm for the night and come back prepared in the morning. As he drove away from Copper Hill Salvage Yard, Jack noticed a different vehicle, a dark sedan parked at a distance down the road, its occupant watching the junkyard entrance. The encounter with Blackwood, his mother's warnings, and now apparent surveillance, whatever secret lay buried in his grandfather's junkyard. It was clearly valuable enough for someone to be very concerned about its discovery. Back at his modest farmhouse, Jack spent the evening researching. First, he looked up Millfield Development Corporation, finding it was a subsidiary of Blackwood Enterprises, a company that had controlled much of the county's real estate for generations. The current CEO, Maxwell Blackwood, was Richard's father and a prominent figure in state politics. Next, Jack searched for information about the Depression's impact on Millfield County. Most historical accounts were surprisingly sparse, noting only that the county had weathered the economic collapse better than most due to the prudent management of local resources by established families. Finally, Jack researched Diebold vault doors from the 1930s, learning they were primarily used in banks and government buildings. The model he'd seen appeared to be a high-security variant, typically used for storing significant valuables or sensitive documents. The pieces weren't fitting together in a way that made sense, but one thing was clear. Whatever lay behind that vault door had been important enough for his grandfather to hide it for decades and for powerful interests to covet it still. Morning brought a new determination. Jack loaded his truck with tools, pry bars, bolt cutters, a small generator, and an angle grinder. If the vault wouldn't open with its intended mechanism, he'd find another way in. He also brought a digital camera to document whatever he might find. As he approached the junkyard, Jack noticed the dark sedan was gone, but fresh tire tracks suggested it had been there recently. Someone was definitely watching the property. Once inside, Jack made his way directly to the central clearing and the hidden vault door. In daylight, he could see more details. The door was remarkably well preserved despite its age. The locking mechanism complex but potentially operational. The wheel handle wouldn't turn locked securely as he'd expected. Jack examined the lock more carefully and noticed it required a key, likely a unique one designed specifically for this vault. Without the key, his options were limited. He returned to the office building, hoping his grandfather might have left some clue about the vault or its contents. A more thorough search of the desk revealed nothing, but when Jack examined the filing cabinets more closely, he noticed one was bolted to the floor while the others weren't. Moving with renewed purpose, Jack cleared the items from the top of this cabinet and examined it from all angles. The back panel seemed different from the others, newer, possibly replaced at some point. When he pulled the cabinet away from the wall as far as the floor bolts would allow, he found a small access panel cut into the rear wall. Inside this hidden compartment was a metal box. Jack's hands trembled slightly as he pulled it out and set it on the desk. The box was locked, but the mechanism was simple. Using a screwdriver from his toolkit, Jack managed to pry it open. Inside lay several items: a leather-bound journal, a manila envelope containing old photographs, what appeared to be banking records from the 1930s, and most importantly, a large brass key with an intricate bit pattern that matched the lock on the vault door. Jack opened the journal first. The handwriting was neat and precise, dating back to 1975, nearly 50 years ago. His grandfather had begun documenting what he called the Millfield conspiracy after discovering unusual records, while clearing out an abandoned bank building for scrap. According to the journal, Harold Miller had uncovered evidence that during the height of the Depression, the Blackwood family and several other prominent Millfield County families had deliberately engineered a local banking collapse, forcing dozens of family farms into foreclosure. While most Americans were struggling through the Depression, these families had used their control of the local bank to acquire vast tracts of land at pennies on the dollar, establishing the wealth and power they still wielded generations later. Most shockingly, Harold had discovered that federal investigators had built a case against the Blackwood-controlled bank in 1937, gathering substantial evidence of fraud and market manipulation. But before the case could be filed, the investigators had mysteriously disappeared, and all official records of their work had vanished from government files. All official records, but not all records. The journal explained that one of the investigators, fearing interference, had hidden a complete copy of their evidence in a secure vault, concealed on what was then a small family farm on the outskirts of Millfield. That farm had eventually become Copper Hill Salvage Yard when Harold Miller purchased it in the early 1970s, unaware of what lay beneath the soil. Harold had discovered the vault while expanding the yard in 1975. After learning what it contained, he had dedicated his life to protecting it, systematically acquiring scrap metal to build a protective labyrinth around the vault's location. The journal detailed repeated attempts by the Blackwood family to acquire the property over the decades, escalating to threats that had eventually led to the family estrangement when Jack's father refused to support Harold's obsessive protection of the vault. The final entry, dated March 2008, was chilling. "They're coming for me now. I've hidden what I can. If you're reading this, and your family, know that what's in the vault is truth. Truth that powerful men have killed to conceal. Be careful who you trust." Jack sat back, mind-reeling. His grandfather hadn't abandoned the salvage yard in 2008. He'd been forced to flee. And now, 15 years later, the Blackwoods were still trying to acquire the property and the evidence it contained. With the key in hand and a new understanding of what he was dealing with, Jack returned to the vault. The key slid perfectly into the lock, turning with surprising ease for a mechanism so old. When Jack spun the wheel handle, the heavy door released with a deep metallic thunk. The door swung outward, revealing a steep set of concrete steps descending into darkness. Jack switched on his flashlight and carefully made his way down. At the bottom, he found himself in a small underground room, perhaps 15 feet square, with walls of fitted concrete blocks. The air was remarkably dry and preserved, suggesting the vault had been well sealed against moisture. Metal shelving units lined the walls, filled with document boxes, ledgers, and what appeared to be evidence containers. A small table stood in the center, covered with a protective cloth. Jack carefully removed the cloth to reveal an old typewriter, papers still inserted as if the user had just stepped away momentarily. The documents on the table were the most damning of federal investigators' final report, detailing how the Blackwood-controlled Millfield County Bank had deliberately called in loans on profitable farms during the height of the Depression, while simultaneously denying standard refinancing options that were available elsewhere in the country. The report included sworn statements from bank employees, internal memos discussing which farms to target, and a handwritten ledger showing how the foreclosed properties had been purchased by shell companies, all leading back to the Blackwood family. What his grandfather had protected all these years wasn't just evidence of historical wrongdoing, it was proof of how one of the most powerful families in the state had built their fortune on the Fazana, deliberate destruction of dozens of farming families during America's most vulnerable economic period. Jack carefully photographed everything, ensuring he had digital backups of the most crucial documents. He then selected the most damning evidence to take with him: the federal investigator's report, the bank's internal memos, and the ownership records showing the Blackwood connection to the shell companies. As he emerged from the vault, squinting in the sudden daylight, Jack was startled by the sound of vehicles approaching. Through the maze of scrap metal, he could see 3 black SUVs pulling up outside the gate. Richard Blackwood stepped out of the first one, accompanied by 2 men who looked more like security than businessmen. Jack quickly secured the vault door, locked it, and concealed the entrance once more with the corrugated metal sheet. He tucked the documents inside his jacket and began making his way through the metal labyrinth, staying low and out of sight. "Miller," Blackwood's voice carried across the junkyard. "We know you're in there. I think it's time we had a proper conversation about your grandfather's collection habits." Jack reached the edge of the scrap maze and peered through a gap between 2 rusted car bodies. Blackwood and his men were now inside the gate, spreading out as they moved into the yard. "You should know that we've been watching this property for years," Blackwood called out. "We know about the vault. We know what's inside it. And we're prepared to be extremely generous to ensure those historical curiosities remain private." Jack's mind raced. He needed to get to his truck, but it was parked in plain view. The office building offered no real security. His only advantage was his knowledge of what he'd discovered and his familiarity with the layout of the junkyard. Moving silently through paths only he and his grandfather would know, Jack circled behind the approaching men. The documents were secure against his chest, the digital camera containing photos of everything else hidden in his pocket. Whatever happened next, the truth his grandfather had protected wouldn't stay buried. "Mr. Blackwood," he called out, now positioned behind the men, near the gate and his truck. "I think you should know that everything in my grandfather's vault has already been documented and backed up. If anything happens to me, it all goes public immediately." Blackwood turned, his face betraying genuine concern for the first time. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, Miller. Those documents are incomplete, misleading. They paint a false picture of historical events that could damage innocent people. Innocent? Jack couldn't keep the incredulity from his voice. I've seen the evidence. Your family deliberately destroyed dozens of farmers during the Depression, stole their land, and then had federal investigators who uncovered the scheme eliminated. Something darkened in Blackwood's expression. Ancient history. Unfortunate business decisions during difficult economic times. No one today should have their reputation tarnished by such misunderstandings. The bank records show your grandfather called in loans specifically on the most valuable properties, Jack countered. The internal memos discuss which families to target first. That wasn't business, that was calculated theft. Blackwood spread his hands in a gesture of false sympathy. You're interpreting complex financial decisions through a modern lens. Those were different times, with different standards. And the federal investigators who disappeared? Were those different standards too? For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Blackwood's face. You have no idea what you're talking about. I know more than you think, Jack bluffed, drawing confidence from the man's reaction. The vault isn't just full of bank records. There's correspondence about the problem of the federal investigation, notes about how to handle it, names of people involved. Blackwood studied him for a long moment, reassessing. What do you want? Money? The salvage yard is worthless. The land has minimal value. But I could offer you a fair price more than fair. I want justice, Jack said. For the families your grandfather ruined. For my grandfather who spent his life protecting the truth. A cold laugh escaped Blackwood. Justice, after 90 years? With evidence collected by a man everyone in the county considered unstable. He shook his head. Be realistic, Miller. Even if you could convince anyone to look into these ancient allegations, my family has relationships with every judge and official in 3 counties. The State Historical Society might be interested, Jack countered, especially with bank records showing deliberate fraud during the Depression. The current Banking Commission might have questions about how your family's financial institutions were founded. This information clearly caught Blackwood off guard, his carefully maintained composure slipping to reveal genuine concern. The property values alone, Jack continued, gaining confidence. Imagine what would happen if every landowner in Millfield County learned their land had been stolen from the original owners through fraud. The lawsuits would be endless. Blackwood's expression hardened. You're making a very serious mistake, Mr. Miller. Your grandfather made the same one. It didn't end well for him. The threat hung in the air between them. Jack's hand moved toward his pocket, where he kept the small canister of pepper spray he carried when working in areas known to have feral dogs. He had no intention of using violence, but he needed to be prepared to defend himself if necessary. Here's what's going to happen, Jack said, surprised at the steadiness in his voice. I'm going to leave this junkyard with copies of everything my grandfather protected. You're not going to follow me or interfere in any way. And then what? Blackwood asked, his tone mocking. You'll single-handedly take down a family that's been the backbone of this county for generations based on some moldy paperwork from a century ago? No, came a new voice from outside the gate. He won't be doing it alone. Both Jack and Blackwood turned toward the unexpected interruption. A woman in her early 40s stood beside a news van, a press badge hanging from her neck, a camera operator beside her. Melissa Chun, State Public Broadcasting, she introduced herself, stepping inside the gate. We've been investigating the Blackwood family's historical banking practices for our documentary series on the Depression's impact on rural communities. Your grandfather reached out to us before he disappeared, Mr. Miller. This property is private, Blackwood snapped, his composed demeanor cracking. You're trespassing. Actually, Melissa countered smoothly, we're here at Mr. Miller's invitation. Your presence, however, seems less welcome. She turned to Jack. We've been searching for your grandfather's evidence for years. When he contacted us in 2008, he mentioned a vault but disappeared before he could show us its location. Jack's mind raced to process this unexpected alliance. "How did you find me?" "We've monitored property transfers in this county for years," Melissa explained. "When Harold Miller's salvage yard changed hands, we hoped his heir might lead us to what he protected." Blackwood's face had gone rigid with anger. "This is absurd. You have nothing but the paranoid delusions of an old junk dealer." "Actually," the camera operator said, raising his equipment, "we have quite a bit more now, including this entire conversation, Mr. Blackwood. Would you like to clarify your comments about things not ending well for Mr. Miller's grandfather?" The color drained from Blackwood's face. For the first time, he seemed genuinely rattled. "You're manipulating my words. This is entrapment." "It's journalism," Melissa replied coolly. "And it's just the beginning. Thanks to Harold Miller's meticulous record-keeping, we now have enough evidence to justify a full investigation by authorities beyond your sphere of influence." A tension-filled silence fell over the junkyard. Blackwood's men exchanged uncertain glances, awaiting direction from their employer. "We should continue this discussion elsewhere," Melissa said to Jack, her expression urgent but controlled. "Mr. Blackwood rarely travels without additional security. They'll be wondering why he's taking so long." As if on cue, the sound of another vehicle approaching reached them, the distinctive rumble of a large engine growing louder. "That would be my son," Blackwood explained with a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Maxwell Jr. handles our more delicate family matters these days." Jack sensed the escalating danger. "We need to leave now." "Mr. Blackwood," Melissa said firmly, "preventing us from leaving could constitute unlawful detention, especially with our camera documenting everything. I've already transmitted preliminary footage to my producers. Your best option now is damage control." The approaching vehicle had stopped. Doors slammed, followed by multiple sets of footsteps. After a tense moment, Blackwood stepped aside with calculated precision. "We'll be speaking again very soon, Mr. Miller. Family matters tend to require personal attention." "The documents show it was never just business," Jack said quietly. "Your family deliberately destroyed people's livelihoods during the nation's worst economic crisis. That's not something that stays buried forever." Something almost like regret flickered across Blackwood's features. "The past is complicated, Mr. Miller. There were considerations you couldn't possibly understand." "Father?" called a younger voice from beyond the scrap metal maze. "Is everything all right?" "Perfectly fine, Maxwell," Blackwood responded, his eyes never leaving Jack's, just having a chat with Harold Miller's grandson about his inheritance. Melissa motioned urgently toward her news van. Jack followed, documents secured inside his jacket, walking backward to keep Blackwood and his men in view until they reached the gate. Only when they were inside the vehicle with doors locked did Jack exhale fully. "Drive," he instructed. "Anywhere away from here." The camera operator slid behind the wheel while Melissa joined Jack in the back seat, her professional composure giving way to barely contained excitement. "We actually found it," she breathed. "After all these years. Harold's vault, the evidence he said would rewrite the county's history. Do you have any idea what you've uncovered?" "I'm starting to," Jack replied, the weight of his discovery still settling on his shoulders. "But I think you need to tell me exactly how you knew my grandfather and what you plan to do with this information." Melissa nodded, composing herself. 5 years ago, I was researching a documentary about rural communities that rebounded unusually quickly from the Depression. Millfield County kept appearing as an anomaly, while surrounding areas struggled well into the 1940s. Millfield had a remarkably swift recovery. "Led by the Blackwood family's investments," Jack guessed. "Exactly. But when I tried to access banking records from that period, I hit walls everywhere. Archives mysteriously incomplete, courthouse records conveniently damaged by water leaks, local historical society oddly resistant to inquiries." The news van turned onto the highway, putting distance between them and the junkyard. In the side mirror, Jack could see two black SUVs pull out onto the road behind them, but remain at the junkyard entrance. That's when Harold Miller contacted me, Melissa continued. Said he'd seen me asking questions around town. Told me he had evidence that would explain everything, proof that the Depression had been weaponized by certain families to consolidate land holdings and wealth. But he disappeared before showing you. Melissa's expression darkened. One day he was arranging to meet me, the next he was gone. The official story was that he'd had some kind of breakdown, moved away to live with relatives. But he'd warned me that if he ever stopped communicating, it would mean they had finally come for him. Jack processed this information, connecting it with his mother's warnings and his grandfather's journal entries. And you've been looking for his evidence ever since. It became something of an obsession, Melissa admitted. The story kept growing bigger, not just about Millfield County, but about how wealth inequality in entire regions can be traced back to deliberate manipulations during times of crisis. The camera operator spoke up from the driver's seat. We should head straight to the station. Get the documents secured and start digitizing everything. Jack tensed. No news station, not yet. We need to make copies first, store them in multiple locations. If the Blackwoods have the influence my grandfather believed, no single institution is safe. He's right, Melissa agreed after a moment's consideration. We need to secure the evidence before going public. That family has been burying this story for 90 years. They won't stop now just because we have documents. I know someone who can help, Jack said, thinking quickly. An old friend who runs a data security company. He can create encrypted backups, store them on servers the Blackwoods can't reach. Good. And I have contacts at the State Historical Archives who can authenticate the documents without drawing attention. Melissa added. Between us, we can build an unassailable case. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. By late afternoon, they had established a temporary base of operations at a motel 30 miles outside Millfield County. Jack's friend, Trevor Washington, a former college roommate who'd gone on to build a successful cybersecurity firm, had responded immediately to Jack's urgent call. Let me get this straight, Trevor said, examining the documents spread across the motel room desk. Your estranged grandfather spent decades protecting evidence that the Blackwood family is in. State Senator Maxwell Blackwood, whose family controls half the banking interests in the region, deliberately engineered foreclosures during the Depression to steal land. That's the simplified version, Jack confirmed. Trevor whistled low. And now they're after you because you found the evidence. Man, when you inherit family problems, you don't mess around. Despite his joking tone, Trevor approached the task with professional precision, photographing each document with a high-resolution camera, creating multiple encrypted backups, and uploading them to secure servers. I'm setting up dead man switches, he explained as he worked. If anything happens to these accounts or to you, the files automatically release to a dozen predetermined recipients, including federal authorities and national news outlets. While Trevor handled the technical aspects, Melissa made calls to trusted contacts, carefully arranging for document authentication without revealing the full scope of what they'd discovered. My source at the State Historical Archives can verify the banking documents tomorrow morning, she reported. And I have a legal historian at the university who can confirm the federal investigation records without asking too many questions. Jack, meanwhile, was diving deeper into his grandfather's journal, uncovering the full extent of Harold Miller's investigation. What had begun with the accidental discovery of the vault had evolved into a decades-long quest for justice. Harold had tracked down descendants of the farmers who had lost their land, documenting oral histories of families destroyed by the Blackwoods' manipulations. He had meticulously connected property records, tracing how foreclosed farms had been broken up and resold at massive profits. Most disturbing were the journal entries about the federal investigators, who had disappeared in 1937. Harold had uncovered newspaper articles about their unfortunate automobile accident on a remote county road, an accident with no witnesses and bodies too damaged for open casket funerals. He had even located and interviewed an elderly mechanic who had examined the wreckage and found evidence of tampering with the vehicle's brake lines. "My grandfather wasn't just protecting historical documents," Jack said, looking up from the journal. "He was building a case for what amounts to historical fraud and possibly murder." "Which explains why the Blackwoods have been so determined to acquire that property," Melissa noted. "It's not just about protecting their reputation. It's about keeping family members out of prison, even after all these years." Trevor looked up from his computer. Statute of limitations would have expired on most of this, wouldn't it? Even for murder, after 90 years. "It's not about criminal prosecution," Melissa explained. "It's about legacy, reputation, and current wealth. The Blackwood financial empire is built on land and assets acquired during that period. If it could be proven they were obtained through fraud, civil cases could be brought by descendants of the original owners. Their entire fortune could be at risk. Not to mention their political power," Jack added. "Senator Blackwood has built his career on his family's story of pulling the county up by its bootstraps during the Depression. This evidence shows they weren't saviors, they were predators. As night fell, they took shifts keeping watch, acutely aware that the Blackwoods would be searching for them." Jack used the time to call his mother, updating her on what he'd discovered and warning her to be cautious. "Your father would be proud," she told him, her voice thick with emotion. "He never believed Harold was paranoid. He just thought the fight was too dangerous, especially with a young family to protect." "Why didn't you tell me the truth?" Jack asked. "What would we have said? That your grandfather was hiding evidence of historical crimes committed by the most powerful family in the region. That he was being threatened and followed. You were 14, Jack. We wanted you to have a normal life." The explanation made sense, but Jack couldn't help feeling that his entire understanding of his family history had been built on half-truths and omissions. Morning brought new developments. Melissa's contact at the State Historical Archives confirmed the banking documents were authentic, genuine records from the 1930s, showing pattern of coordinated foreclosures, targeting specific properties. The legal historian verified that the federal investigation documents matched known government formats and protocols from the period. "We have confirmation," Melissa announced, ending the call. "Everything checks out. These documents are exactly what your grandfather claimed, evidence of a coordinated campaign to exploit the Depression for land acquisition." With authentication complete, they moved to the next phase of their plan, strategic disclosure to authorities beyond the Blackwoods' influence. "We need to approach this carefully," Melissa cautioned. "The Blackwoods have connections throughout the state government. If we alert the wrong people, the evidence could be suppressed before it ever becomes public." "What about the federal level?" Trevor suggested. "Banking fraud falls under federal jurisdiction, even historical cases." Jack nodded slowly. "The U.S. Attorney's Office. They'd be beyond the Blackwoods' immediate reach." As they discussed options, Jack's phone rang, an unknown number with the local area code. Wary but curious, he answered on speaker. "Mr. Miller," came Richard Blackwood's smooth voice. "I believe we have unfinished business to discuss." Jack exchanged glances with the others before responding. "I don't see what's left to discuss, Mr. Blackwood. The evidence speaks for itself." "Evidence can be interpreted many ways," Blackwood replied. "Context matters. History is never as black and white as old documents might suggest." "What do you want?" "A meeting. Just you and me. I believe I can provide perspective that might change how you view what you've discovered." Jack covered the phone's microphone. "It's a trap," Trevor whispered. "They're trying to locate us." Melissa shook her head. "Maybe not. The Blackwoods are pragmatists above all. If they can't suppress the evidence, they'll try to control the narrative. Jack removed his hand from the microphone. Where and when? The Millfield Historical Society. 1 hour. Come alone, this should be a family discussion, in a sense. After all, your grandfather and mine were once deeply connected in this matter. The call ended, leaving them in troubled silence. You can't seriously be considering this, Trevor protested. Actually, I am, Jack replied. Not because I trust Blackwood, but because I want to hear what he thinks is worth saying at this point. It's too dangerous, Melissa argued. Even in a public place, they could have people waiting. Which is why I won't be alone, Jack countered. You'll be nearby, documenting everything. And by now, the evidence is secured in too many places for them to suppress it by dealing with me. Despite their concerns, the logic was sound. With multiple backups of the evidence already secured and dead man switches in place, Jack's physical safety was no longer tied to the evidence's survival. Whatever Blackwood wanted to discuss, it couldn't undo what they'd already accomplished. The Millfield Historical Society occupied a stately Victorian mansion on the town square, a building that had once belonged to, ironically enough, the Blackwood family, donated to the county in the 1950s as a gesture of civic commitment. When Jack arrived, the building appeared quiet, with only a few visitors visible through the front windows. Melissa and Trevor positioned themselves in a cafe across the square, watching through the windows with a directional microphone aimed at the Historical Society building. Jack wore a concealed recording device as an additional precaution. Inside, an elderly docent greeted him warmly. "Mr. Miller, welcome. Mr. Blackwood is waiting for you in the founder's room. May I show you the way?" The founder's room proved to be a wood-paneled library on the mansion's second floor, its walls lined with portraits of Millfield County's founding families, the Blackwoods prominently featured. Richard Blackwood stood by the windows, looking out over the town square. He turned as Jack entered, dismissing the docent with a nod. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Miller. I realize you have little reason to trust me at this point." Jack remained by the door, maintaining distance. "What's this about, Blackwood? More threats? Another offer to buy me off?" "Neither, actually." Blackwood gestured to a large leather portfolio on the reading table. "I wanted to show you something that might provide context for what you found in your grandfather's vault." Cautiously, Jack approached the table. The portfolio contained old photographs, newspaper clippings, and what appeared to be personal letters, all meticulously preserved. "Do you know what happened to Millfield County before the Depression?" Blackwood asked, his tone surprisingly conversational. "We were dying. The soil was depleted from decades of poor farming practices. Young people were leaving in droves. The infrastructure was crumbling. When the crash hit in '29, it merely accelerated a decline that was already well underway." Jack remained silent, examining the materials. The newspapers documented declining crop yields, population loss, and business closures throughout the 1920s. "My grandfather, Maxwell Blackwood Sr., had a vision," Blackwood continued. "Not just to save his own interests, but to save the entire county. He recognized that the small-scale farming model had been failing for years. The future lay in modernization, consolidation, and diversification. So he engineered foreclosures to steal land from struggling families," Jack countered. "That's not vision, that's predation." Blackwood shook his head. Those farms were already failing. The families were already desperate. What the bank did was accelerate an inevitable process and guide it toward a productive outcome rather than letting the entire county collapse into poverty. He pointed to photographs showing new industrial developments from the late 1930s, a grain processing facility, a textile mill, paved roads connecting formerly isolated communities. Within 5 years of the consolidation, Millfield County had higher employment, better infrastructure, and more economic opportunity than any time in its history. The children of those farmers who lost their land found jobs in industries that would sustain their families for generations. Jack studied the materials with a historian's critical eye. There was truth in what Blackwood was saying. The county had indeed recovered more quickly than its neighbors, and the modernization had brought genuine benefits. But the methods remained unconscionable. "You're justifying theft and fraud as necessary for progress," Jack said finally. "Your grandfather may have had a vision, but he didn't give those families a choice. He manipulated the system to force an outcome that benefited him first and foremost." "The outcome benefited everyone," Blackwood insisted. "Including, I might add, your own family. The salvage yard your grandfather operated? It thrived because of the industrial development that followed consolidation. The very prosperity that allowed him to accumulate all that metal was built on my grandfather's vision." The observation struck uncomfortably close to home. Jack had never considered that his own family's modest wealth might be connected to the very changes his grandfather had been fighting against. "What's your point in showing me all this?" Jack asked. "The evidence of fraud and manipulation still exists. The federal investigators who tried to expose it still disappeared under suspicious circumstances." Blackwood sighed, suddenly looking older and more tired than before. "My point, Mr. Miller, is that history is complex. Narratives of heroes and villains rarely capture the full truth. Yes, my grandfather used aggressive tactics during desperate times. Yes, some of his actions wouldn't stand up to today's ethical or legal standards. But his vision saved this county when it was on the brink of total collapse." He closed the portfolio carefully. "I'm not asking you to destroy the evidence or to abandon your search for truth. I'm asking you to consider the complete story before you publicly vilify a family that, for all its flaws, helped build everything you see around you." Jack studied Blackwood's face, searching for the manipulation behind his words. "What exactly are you proposing?" "A balanced disclosure. Work with the Historical Society with me to present the full context of what happened during that period. The consolidation, yes, but also the revitalization that followed. The hardships, but also the ultimate benefits. Not a whitewashing, but a complete accounting." It was not the offer Jack had expected. "And the federal investigators?" "The evidence of criminal acts." "Include it all," Blackwood said, surprising Jack further. "After 90 years, the legal implications are minimal. What matters now is the historical record, getting it right in all its complicated truth." Jack remained skeptical. "Why would you agree to that?" "Your family's reputation will endure," Blackwood finished. "But not if we appear to be suppressing history. The documents will come to light one way or another, you've ensured that. The question now is whether they emerge as part of a thoughtful historical examination or as sensationalized exposes designed to destroy rather than illuminate." Jack stood silently by the reading table, torn between suspicion and a growing understanding of the complex moral landscape before him. He had entered expecting the confrontation, perhaps another threat or bribe attempt. Instead, Blackwood was offering something more nuanced acknowledgement of past wrongdoing, coupled with a plea for historical context. "How do I know this isn't just another manipulation?" Jack finally asked. "Yesterday you were ready to bury this evidence permanently. Today you're suddenly advocating for historical transparency?" Blackwood moved to a leather chair, gesturing for Jack to sit opposite him. "Yesterday I was operating on assumptions that you were like your grandfather, determined to vilify my family regardless of context. Today I recognize that you're a man seeking truth, not revenge. The truth is that your family orchestrated fraud on a massive scale," Jack countered, remaining standing. "People lost everything." "Yes," Blackwood acknowledged, surprising Jack with his candor. "By today's standards, what my grandfather did was unconscionable. But history demands we view actions in their context. The alternative wasn't prosperity for those small farmers, it was collective ruin for the entire county. Jack's phone vibrated in his pocket, likely Melissa or Trevor checking on him. He ignored it, focused on the conversation at hand. "What happened to the federal investigators?" he asked directly. "The men who disappeared while building a case against your family's bank?" Blackwood's expression tightened. "That is a more difficult question. The official record shows an automobile accident on a dangerous mountain road. My grandfather's private accounts suggest otherwise." "Murder," Jack stated flatly. "Intervention," Blackwood corrected, though the euphemism rang hollow even to his own ears. "A desperate act during desperate times. My grandfather believed the investigators' report would trigger a federal takeover that would destroy not just his plans, but the county's last chance at recovery." Jack struggled to reconcile his moral outrage with the historical complexity unfolding before him. His grandfather had preserved evidence of genuine crimes, yet the consequences of exposing those crimes without context risked oversimplifying a nuanced historical reality. "I need to consult with my colleagues," Jack said finally. "This isn't just my decision to make." Blackwood nodded. "I understand. But remember, Mr. Miller, history isn't served by exchanging one simplistic narrative for another. The truth is always more complicated than heroes and villains." As Jack turned to leave, Blackwood added, "Whatever you decide, the Historical Society's archives are open to you. There's more context there that might help inform your choice." Outside in the town square, Jack met Melissa and Trevor at the cafe. Both looked concerned. "We caught most of that," Melissa said, indicating the directional microphone they'd been using. "He's trying to control the narrative." "Of course he is," Trevor agreed. "Classic damage control, admit to lesser evils to mitigate the greater ones." Jack sank into a chair, mind racing. But what if he's right about the historical context? What if exposing the fraud without acknowledging the subsequent development paints an incomplete picture? Melissa's expression softened with understanding. "You're thinking like a historian now, not just someone seeking justice for your grandfather." "That's not necessarily wrong. But we can't let the Blackwoods whitewash what they did," Trevor insisted. "People should know the truth. The complete truth," Jack emphasized. "Including what came after. The revitalization, the industrial development, all of it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. Their discussion continued through lunch, weighing ethical considerations against historical accuracy. By mid-afternoon, they had reached a tentative agreement. They would proceed with disclosure of the evidence, but within a framework that acknowledged the full historical context, both the exploitation and the subsequent development that had transformed the county. "We should visit the Historical Society archives," Jack suggested. "See what additional context might be relevant before making final decisions." The Millfield Historical Society's archives occupied the mansion's entire third floor, a treasure trove of county records, photographs, personal papers, and artifacts spanning 2 centuries. The archivist, a retired history professor named Dr. Eleanor Jenkins, greeted them with professional curiosity. "Mr. Blackwood mentioned you might be visiting," she said, leading them through the climate-controlled rooms. "He was quite insistent that you have full access to all materials." Jack explained their interest in the Depression era and the county's subsequent recovery. Without revealing the vault's existence, he described their research into the banking practices and land consolidation of the period. Dr. Jenkins proved surprisingly forthcoming. "The Blackwood consolidation has always been a sensitive topic in local historiography," she admitted. "The official narrative celebrates the modernization without examining the methods too closely." "And the unofficial narrative?" Melissa prompted. "Exists primarily in oral histories and family stories," the archivist replied. Many descendants of those who lost land still carry resentment, though most have benefited from the industrial development that followed. She directed them to collections documenting both aspects, the foreclosures and the recovery. As they examined the materials, a more nuanced picture emerged. The pre-Depression county had indeed been struggling with depleted soil, outdated farming practices, and an exodus of young people. The consolidation, however brutal in execution, had enabled a transition from failing small farms to diversified agriculture and industrial development. Most revealing were records of what happened to the displaced farmers. Contrary to Jack's assumptions, many had remained in the county, finding employment in the new industries established on their former lands. Their children and grandchildren had opportunities that might never have materialized in the failing agricultural economy. It's not a simple story of villains and victims, Dr. Jenkins observed, watching Jack examine a photograph of former farmers working at the new grain processing facility in 1941. The methods were unconscionable by modern standards, but the outcome benefited many, including descendants of those who lost their land. That doesn't justify fraud, Jack maintained. No, the archivist agreed. But history requires us to acknowledge complexity. The Blackwoods' actions were simultaneously exploitative and transformative. Both realities exist together. By evening, Jack, Melissa, and Trevor had gathered at their motel to make final decisions. The additional context had complicated their initial moral clarity, forcing them to reconsider how best to present the evidence Jack had discovered. "We proceed with disclosure," Jack began, "but within a framework that acknowledges the full historical context. The fraud and manipulation, yes, but also the subsequent development and its benefits. A balanced historical assessment rather than a sensationalized expose," Melissa agreed. "It's actually better journalism, more nuanced, more complete." Trevor remained skeptical. The Blackwoods still committed crimes. People still suffered. "We can't let context obscure that reality." "It won't," Jack assured him. "But we'd be doing our own form of manipulation if we presented only the exploitation without acknowledging what followed. History deserves our honesty, even when it's complicated." They outlined a plan. Melissa would produce a documentary examining the complete history, from the pre-Depression struggles through the controversial consolidation to the subsequent development. The vault documents would be donated to the State Historical Archives, ensuring their preservation and accessibility to future researchers. Most importantly, they would establish a fund to support continued historical research into the period, encouraging scholars to examine the complex legacy of the Blackwood consolidation. The next morning, they met Richard Blackwood at the Historical Society to present their proposal. He listened carefully, his expression revealing little. "This isn't what I expected," he admitted when Jack finished outlining their plan. "I anticipated either capitulation or a crusade." "History deserves better than either," Jack replied. "Your grandfather did wrong, but that wrong existed within a complex historical reality. The documentary and archived evidence will reflect that complexity." Blackwood studied him thoughtfully. "And the investigators? The evidence of their intervention?" "Will be included," Jack confirmed. "Some truths can't be contextualized away. What happened to them was murder, regardless of your grandfather's rationalizations." After a moment's consideration, Blackwood nodded. "I can live with that. The family's reputation will suffer, but perhaps it should. Truth has its own moral imperative." In the weeks that followed, Jack divided his time between his struggling farm and the historical project. The documentary production moved forward, with Melissa conducting interviews with historians, economists, and descendants of families affected by the consolidation. The vault documents were carefully cataloged and prepared for transfer to the state archives. Most surprisingly, the Blackwood family, following Richard's lead, cooperated with the project. Maxwell Sr.'s private papers were made available, providing insight into his motivations and calculations during the Depression. While they revealed a man willing to use ruthless methods, they also showed genuine concern for the county's long-term survival. One morning, as Jack was struggling to repair an irrigation pump on his farm, a familiar black SUV pulled up his driveway. Richard Blackwood stepped out, looking oddly out of place in his tailored suit amid the dusty farmyard. "Mr. Miller," he greeted Jack, "I hope I'm not interrupting." Jack wiped his hands on a rag, eyeing his visitor warily. "What brings you all the way out here, Blackwood?" "A proposition," Blackwood replied, "though not the kind you might expect." He gestured toward Jack's fields, where the effects of 3 years of drought were clearly visible in the stressed crops and dry soil. "Your grandfather's salvage yard isn't the only property you're responsible for, I understand." Jack's defenses rose immediately. "The farm's not for sale, if that's what you're asking." "Quite the opposite," Blackwood surprised him by saying. "I'm here to offer assistance." He explained that Blackwood Agricultural Industries had developed drought-resistant seed varieties, specifically engineered for the region's changing climate conditions. The company was seeking test farms to implement these seeds along with sustainable water management systems. "We'd cover all implementation costs," Blackwood explained. "In return, we'd monitor results and use the data to refine our approaches. You'd keep all profits from the improved yields." Jack's suspicion was immediate. "Why me?" "There are plenty of larger operations that would jump at this opportunity." Blackwood's answer was unexpectedly candid. "Because you've taught me something. Mr. Miller, your insistence on a complete historical accounting, neither vilifying nor whitewashing my family, showed integrity I've rarely encountered. If we're going to address the agricultural challenges facing this region, we need partners with that same integrity." The offer was compelling. Jack's farm was barely surviving the drought. New seed varieties and water management systems could transform its prospects. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that this was another form of manipulation. "This isn't about buying my silence or cooperation with the documentary?" Jack asked directly. "The documentary proceeds exactly as planned," Blackwood assured him. "This is about the future, not the past. My grandfather used consolidation to address the agricultural crisis of his era. I'm trying to use innovation to address the crisis of ours." After careful consideration and consultation with agricultural experts who confirmed the legitimacy of the technology, Jack accepted the offer. Within months, his struggling farm began to transform. The drought-resistant crops thrived where traditional varieties had failed. The water management system reduced consumption while improving yield. For the first time in years, the farm showed promise of not merely surviving but prospering. Meanwhile, Melissa's documentary neared completion. Titled Consolidation: The Untold Story of Millfield County, it presented a nuanced examination of the Depression era. Transformations acknowledging both the exploitation inherent in the Blackwood methods and the genuine development that followed. The vault documents featured prominently, their discovery and preservation becoming part of the historical narrative. The documentary premiered at a regional film festival, with Jack, his mother, Melissa, Trevor, and surprisingly Richard Blackwood all in attendance. The audience response was thoughtful rather than outraged, appreciative of the complex historical reality presented rather than a simplified narrative of villains and victims. At the reception following the screening, Richard approached Jack with an unexpected question. "Have you considered what will happen to your grandfather's salvage yard?" Jack had been so focused on the historical project and his farm's revival that he'd given little thought to the property that had started everything. "I suppose I'll sell it eventually," he admitted. "Not much use for a junkyard in my future plans." Blackwood nodded thoughtfully. "I'd like to make a suggestion if I may. The vault beneath that property represents a significant historical site, the place where evidence that changed our understanding of the county's development was preserved for decades." "What are you suggesting?" Jack asked. "A memorial," Blackwood replied. Not to my family or yours specifically, but to the complex history of this region. The site could be developed as an educational center, teaching future generations about both the exploitation and innovation that shaped Millfield County. The idea resonated with Jack. His grandfather had protected that vault not merely to expose wrongdoing, but to ensure the truth would eventually be known. A memorial and education center would fulfill that purpose in ways Harold Miller might never have imagined. 6 months later, ground was broken on the Millfield County Historical Center at the former Copper Hill Salvage Yard. The vault was carefully preserved as the centerpiece exhibit, surrounded by displays examining the county's transformation from struggling agricultural community to diversified economic center. School groups would visit to learn about the region's complex past, encouraged to consider the ethical dimensions of economic development and the importance of preserving historical truth. Jack's farm, meanwhile, had become a model for sustainable agriculture in changing climate conditions. The drought-resistant crops and water management systems pioneered there were being adopted by other farms throughout the county, creating a new kind of agricultural transformation, one built on innovation and sustainability rather than consolidation and exploitation. On the day the historical center opened to the public, Jack stood beside the preserved vault entrance, watching visitors examine the displays with curiosity and thoughtfulness. His mother stood nearby, tears in her eyes as she witnessed her father-in-law's life work transformed into an educational legacy. "He would have been proud," she said quietly. "Not of the recognition, but of the truth finally being known, the complete truth. Not just the parts that fit a simple narrative." Richard Blackwood approached, extending his hand to Jack. Their relationship remained complex, neither friendship nor enmity, but a mutual recognition of the intricate moral landscape they navigated together. "Your grandfather and mine were adversaries," Blackwood observed. "Yet together, across time, they've created something valuable, a more honest understanding of our shared history." Jack nodded, accepting the handshake. Truth is never as simple as we wish it were. That's what this place teaches. As visitors moved through the exhibits, engaging with the county's complex past, Jack reflected on how differently events might have unfolded. Had he simply sold the junkyard without investigating, the vault's contents might have been destroyed forever. Had he used the evidence solely for revenge, the resulting narrative would have been incomplete. Instead, by insisting on historical complexity, he had helped transform a buried secret into an educational resource for generations to come. The bulldozer that had once threatened to flatten his grandfather's legacy had instead uncovered a deeper truth, that history resists simplification, that villains and heroes often coexist in the same historical figures, and that understanding our past requires the courage to acknowledge its full complexity. For Jack Miller, the inheritance that had initially seemed a burden had become a gift, not merely to himself or his struggling farm, but to an entire community's understanding of its own history. And in that understanding lay the seeds of a more honest, more sustainable future. The sun rose over Millfield County with golden promise, casting long shadows across the rusted metal landscape of Copper Hill Salvage Yard. Jack arrived early, determined to make progress on clearing a path to the vault entrance. After his meeting with Blackwood and subsequent discussions with Melissa and Trevor, they had agreed on a careful approach: document everything thoroughly before making any decisions about public disclosure. A rental bulldozer had been delivered the previous evening, and Jack climbed into the operator's seat with determination. He'd operated similar equipment on his farm, though nothing quite this large. The machine roared to life, and Jack began the methodical work of clearing a direct access path to the center of the junkyard where the vault lay hidden. Metal groaned and shifted as decades of accumulated scrap were pushed aside. What his grandfather had arranged with painstaking care over years, Jack was rearranging in hours. Yet he worked with respect, understanding now that the seeming chaos had been a deliberate protective strategy. By mid-morning, Trevor arrived with additional recording equipment and a structural engineer who specialized in historical preservation. The engineer, Dr. Amara Patel, examined the exposed concrete pad and vault door with professional fascination. "This is remarkable," she declared, kneeling to inspect the mechanism. A Diebold vault door from the 1930s, maintained in near-perfect condition, despite being buried in a junkyard for decades. "Your grandfather must have been performing regular maintenance." Jack nodded, remembering the gleaming quality of the lock mechanism when he'd first discovered it. "He protected this place his entire life. I'm only beginning to understand why." With Dr. Patel's guidance, they established a proper excavation perimeter around the vault entrance, setting up lights and recording equipment to document every step of the process. The structural engineer confirmed what Jack had suspected. The vault extended well below ground level, with the door being merely the entrance to what appeared to be a significant underground structure. Based on ground-penetrating radar readings, you're looking at approximately 20 by 30 feet of underground space, Dr. Patel explained, showing them the scan results on her tablet. Properly constructed with reinforced concrete. This wasn't some makeshift hiding place, this was professional construction. By early afternoon, Melissa arrived with news that changed their understanding of the vault entirely. "I found something in the county building records," she announced, spreading architectural drawings on the hood of Jack's truck. This property wasn't always a salvage yard. In the early 1930s, it was the site of the Millfield County Reserve Bank, a small regional banking facility that closed in 1935 during the banking consolidation. Jack studied the drawings with growing amazement. So the vault wasn't built to hide evidence, it was already here. This was an actual bank vault. "Exactly," Melissa confirmed. When the bank closed, the building was eventually demolished, but the underground vault remained. According to property records, your grandfather purchased this land in 1972, shortly after finding employment records that mentioned the abandoned vault. Trevor whistled low. So he didn't build a hiding place, he found one ready-made. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The revelation cast Harold Miller's decades-long protection of the property in a new light. He hadn't merely been a man obsessed with historical injustice. He'd been the guardian of a literal buried treasure of evidence, preserved in the very vault that had once housed the bank records documenting the Blackwood family's manipulations. With renewed purpose, they focused on opening the vault properly. The key Jack had found worked perfectly in the mechanism, but decades of disuse had made the door difficult to move. Dr. Patel supervised as they carefully applied lubricant to the hinges and pressure points, ensuring no damage would occur to the historical structure. "Ready?" Jack asked as they prepared for the final attempt to open the vault door. Melissa positioned her camera while Trevor stood ready with additional lighting. Dr. Patel gave a confirming nod. Jack took a deep breath and turned the wheel mechanism fully, feeling the satisfying release of the locking bolts. With careful pressure, the massive door began to swing outward, revealing a dark chamber beyond. The air that escaped was remarkably dry and preserved, carrying the faint scent of paper and metal. Jack switched on his flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness to reveal an underground room that had remained untouched for decades. "Incredible," Melissa breathed as they cautiously entered. The vault was larger than they had anticipated, its walls lined with metal shelving units and filing cabinets. At the center stood a large wooden table, its surface covered with neatly arranged document boxes and leather-bound ledgers. Everything was meticulously organized, with typed labels indicating dates and contents. "Your grandfather wasn't just preserving evidence," Trevor observed. "He was curating it, organizing it for future discovery." Jack moved through this space with growing awe, recognizing the scale of his grandfather's commitment. The vault contained not just the banking records and evidence of financial manipulation he'd initially discovered, but a comprehensive archive of Millfield County's transformation during the Depression and beyond. One section contained personal narratives interviews Harold had conducted with aging farmers who had lost their land, their stories preserved on cassette tapes and in careful transcriptions. Another held newspaper clippings documenting the miraculous economic recovery of the county under Blackwood leadership, alongside suppressed reports of protests and resistance from displaced families. Most significantly, an entire wall was dedicated to the federal investigation that had been abruptly terminated in 1937. The investigators' original notes, photographs, and preliminary findings were preserved in acid-free boxes, alongside newspaper reports of their tragic accident and Harold's own research into the suspicious circumstances surrounding their deaths. "This isn't just evidence of financial fraud," Melissa said, carefully examining a box of documents. "This is a comprehensive counter-history of Millfield County, the version that never made it into official records." Dr. Patel moved through the space with professional admiration. "The preservation conditions are remarkable. Low humidity, stable temperature. Your grandfather understood archival science. These documents are in better condition than many professionally maintained collections I've seen." For hours, they carefully cataloged the vault's contents, creating a detailed inventory while ensuring nothing was damaged in the process. The scope of Harold Miller's work became increasingly clear. He had spent decades not only protecting the evidence, but expanding upon it, creating connections between seemingly unrelated events to reveal the full extent of the Blackwood family's influence over the county's development. As evening approached, Jack found himself drawn to a small metal box tucked beneath the central table. Unlike the meticulously labeled archives surrounding it, this container bore only his name, for Jack, in his grandfather's distinctive handwriting. With slightly trembling hands, Jack opened the box, finding a sealed envelope inside. The others respectfully gave him space as he broke the seal and unfolded a letter dated just weeks before his grandfather's disappearance in 2008. "Jack," it began, "if you're reading this, then you found what I've protected for most of my life. I never wanted this burden for you, but I always hoped that someday someone from our family would discover the truth." The letter continued, explaining how Harold had stumbled upon the abandoned bank vault while searching for scrap metal in the early 1970s. Inside, he'd found records that had supposedly been destroyed during the bank's closure, evidence of the systematic manipulation that had allowed the Blackwood family to acquire vast tracts of land during the Depression. "I could have exposed it then," Harold wrote, "but I quickly learned the Blackwood's influence extended to law enforcement, local government, even state officials. Any direct accusation would have been buried along with me, perhaps. So I chose a different path. I purchased the property, protected the evidence, and began building a case so comprehensive it couldn't be dismissed as conspiracy or delusion." The most painful section addressed the family estrangement that had shaped Jack's life. "Your father didn't abandon my cause out of disbelief, Jack. He left because I asked him to. When the threats began targeting our family, when I found men watching your school, I knew I had to separate you all from my work. The distance between us was my final gift to your father and to you. Safety through separation. I hope someday you'll understand and forgive me for the years we lost." The letter concluded with a simple request. "Now the choice is yours, Jack. This truth has cost me everything I loved. Before you decide to reveal it, be certain the price is one you're willing to pay. Whatever you choose, know that I have always been proud to call you my grandson. With love, Harold." Jack folded the letter carefully, emotions too complex for words washing over him. The grandfather he'd believed had driven his family away had actually sacrificed his relationship with them to keep them safe. The apparent paranoia that had defined Harold Miller and family stories had been legitimate caution in the face of genuine threats. "Jack?" Melissa's gentle voice broke through his thoughts. "Are you okay?" He nodded slowly. My grandfather gave up everything to protect this evidence, and to protect us from the consequences of knowing about it. Now we have to decide what to do with it. They secured the vault for the night, setting up motion detection cameras around the property before departing. Jack returned to his farm with copies of key documents, spending hours at his kitchen table examining the evidence his grandfather had preserved for decades. The materials painted a damning picture of the Blackwood family's methods during the Depression, not merely opportunistic business decisions during difficult times, but calculated manipulation of banking policies to force specific families off valuable land. The federal investigators had been building a solid case before their deaths, documenting patterns that couldn't be dismissed as coincidence. Yet Jack also found himself considering Blackwood's plea for historical context. The county records showed undeniable economic improvement following the consolidation new industries, improved infrastructure, greater resilience during subsequent national downturns. Many descendants of displaced farmers had found prosperity working in the businesses established on their former lands. The next morning, Richard Blackwood arrived unannounced at Jack's farm, his luxury sedan looking out of place amid the working vehicles and equipment. "You've opened the vault," he stated as Jack met him in the driveway. Not a question, but a recognition of changed circumstances. Jack nodded. "We spent yesterday cataloging its contents. And?" Blackwood's composure couldn't quite mask his apprehension. "It's more comprehensive than I initially realized," Jack replied. "My grandfather spent decades building a case, not just about the land acquisitions, but about the investigators who disappeared while looking into your family's banking practices." Something shifted in Blackwood's expression, a subtle acknowledgement that certain lines of defense had been crossed. "I'd like to see it. All of it. Before you make any decisions about public disclosure." The request surprised Jack. "Why?" "Because whatever my grandfather did, this is my family's legacy now. I need to understand exactly what I'm confronting." After consideration, Jack agreed. They drove together to the Junkyard, where Melissa and Trevor were already continuing the documentation process. The tension was palpable as Blackwood entered the vault, surrounded by evidence of his family's darkest chapter. For hours, Blackwood reviewed the materials in silence, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but offering no defense or justification. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of genuine revelation. "I knew some of this," he admitted. "Family stories, hints in private papers. But not the extent, not the deliberate nature of it all." He closed a ledger containing lists of targeted properties. "My grandfather portrayed himself as the county's savior during the Depression. I never questioned that narrative." "Few people ever saw the complete picture," Jack acknowledged. "That was the point of my grandfather's work, to assemble all the pieces in one place." Blackwood moved to the section containing evidence about the federal investigators. "And this? The accident that wasn't an accident?" "My grandfather believed your family was responsible for their deaths," Jack said directly. "The evidence is circumstantial but compelling." The silence that followed was heavy with historical reckoning. Finally, Blackwood spoke again, his voice changed. "What do you intend to do with all this?" It was the question Jack had been wrestling with since discovering the vault. The easiest path would be sensationalized exposure, a story of Depression-era fraud and corruption that would destroy the Blackwood family's carefully maintained reputation. But such an approach risked oversimplifying a complex historical reality. "I'm considering a different approach," Jack said carefully. "Not burying the truth, but presenting it with its full context, the exploitation and the development, the harm and the subsequent benefits. The complete story of how Millfield County was transformed, for better and worse." Blackwood studied him with new respect. "That's more than I expected. More than my family deserves, perhaps." "It's not about what your family deserves," Jack clarified. "It's about historical truth. The complete truth, not just the parts that fit a simple narrative of villains and victims. The conversation continued outside the vault, where Melissa and Trevor joined them. Together, they outlined a potential approach, a comprehensive historical project that would preserve the evidence while placing it within its broader context. The vault itself would be properly excavated and preserved, potentially becoming part of a county historical exhibit that acknowledged both the exploitative methods of the Blackwood consolidation and the economic development that followed. "My family's reputation will suffer," Blackwood acknowledged. "There's no avoiding that. But perhaps it should. The truth has its own moral imperative." The weeks that followed transformed not just the Junkyard, but Jack's understanding of his inheritance. With proper permits secured, the vault was professionally excavated and preserved, its contents cataloged by State Historical Society experts. Melissa began production on a documentary examining the complex legacy of the Blackwood consolidation, featuring interviews with historians, economists, and descendants of families on both sides of the historical divide. Most surprisingly, Jack found himself partnering with Richard Blackwood on a project neither could have anticipated. The Millfield Historical Trust was established, dedicated to preserving the county's complete history, including its uncomfortable truths. The Junkyard property was transformed into the site of a small museum focused on economic development during the Depression, with the restored vault as its centerpiece. For Jack, the salvage yard that had initially seemed a burden had become something entirely different, a bridge between past and future, a means of honoring his grandfather's dedication while ensuring that historical truth, in all its complexity, would be preserved for generations to come. On the day the museum opened to the public, Jack stood beside the preserved vault entrance, watching visitors examine the exhibits with curiosity and thoughtfulness. The narrative presented wasn't a simple tale of heroes and villains, but a nuanced examination of how communities transform during economic crisis, the exploitation, the innovation, the winners and losers in times of radical change. Richard Blackwood approached, extending his hand. "Your grandfather and mine were adversaries," he observed. "Yet together, across time, they've created something valuable, a more honest understanding of our shared history." Jack accepted the handshake, recognizing the complex moral journey they had navigated together. "The truth is never as simple as we wish it were," he replied. "That's what this place teaches." As evening fell and the last visitors departed, Jack walked alone through the museum that had once been his grandfather's protective fortress of rust and metal. The inheritance that had begun as an unwanted responsibility had become a gift, not just to himself, but to an entire community's understanding of its past. In the museum office, formerly his grandfather's cluttered workspace, Jack found a photograph he'd recently discovered among Harold's personal effects. It showed a much younger Harold standing proudly beside his first salvage truck, the beginnings of what would become Copper Hill Salvage Yard visible in the background. The date on the back read 1972, the year he had discovered the abandoned vault and begun his decades-long mission to protect its contents. Jack placed the photograph in a frame on the office wall, a reminder that sometimes the most valuable inheritance isn't property or money, but purpose. His grandfather had dedicated his life to preserving truth, sacrificing family relationships and personal safety to ensure that historical justice would eventually prevail. Now Jack had transformed that solitary mission into a community resource, a place where difficult truths could be acknowledged and complex legacies examined. The vault that powerful interests had tried to keep buried had instead become a foundation for a more honest understanding of the past and perhaps a more thoughtful approach to the future. For Jack Miller, the poor farmer who had reluctantly signed inheritance papers for an old junkyard, this was the true treasure his grandfather had left him, not just truth, but the opportunity to make that truth matter. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.